Picture this. You walk into a BMW dealership on a Tuesday. You've saved up. You've done your research. You know exactly what you want, a 3 Series, loaded. Maybe a little over your budget, but you've justified it 100 times in your head. The salesman shakes your hand. You sit down. He slides the paper across the desk, and the number on it is $20,000 higher than what you saw on the website yesterday. You blink. You ask if there's been a mistake. There hasn't. Overnight, while you were sleeping, while the rest of America was going about its business, Donald Trump picked up a pen, signed his name to a piece of paper, and effectively erased European cars from the American market. Not with a ban. Not with a law that says you can't have them, but with something far more powerful than a ban, a price so painful, so deliberately brutal, that buying one stops making any rational sense at all. 35%. That's the number. That's the tariff. And that single figure has just detonated like a financial bomb at the center of one of the most consequential trade relationships in modern history. This isn't a story about cars. Not really. This is a story about power, about decades of resentment finally boiling over, about the collapse of a trade architecture that took 50 years to build, and about the question that every economist, every factory worker in Stuttgart, every Ford executive in Detroit, and every American consumer standing in a dealership parking lot is now asking with genuine fear in their voice. What comes next? Let's set the scene properly, because the scale of what just happened hasn't fully landed for most people yet. The morning after the Automotive Fair Trade Act was signed, shipping terminals at Bremerhaven, Europe's single largest automotive export hub, a port that moves more than 2 million vehicles every year, began going quiet. Not completely, not all at once. But logistics companies started refusing new booking requests for U.S.-bound shipments. Vessels already crossing the Atlantic with cargo, holds full of German engineering, suddenly became the subjects of emergency legal consultations. Lawyers were on the phone at 3 a.m. asking the same question over and over. Does the cargo get taxed at the old rate or the new one when it hits the dock? Nobody had a clean answer. In Stuttgart, one of the most important industrial cities in the world, the city where Mercedes-Benz and Porsche were essentially born, boardrooms that had been quietly concerned for months were now running full-scale emergency sessions, not planning sessions, not strategic reviews, emergency sessions. The kind where no one in the room is entirely sure the company they've spent their careers building looks the same on the other side. And in Detroit, Ford stock was up 6% before noon. General Motors climbed nearly 6%. Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, jumped over 7% in a single trading day. Wall Street didn't need a press release to understand what had just happened. The most formidable foreign competition in the American auto market had just been kneecapped by executive order, and the domestic industry was staring at a vacuum worth tens of billions of dollars. But let's back up, because to understand why this moment is being compared to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, the most destructive trade legislation in American history, you have to understand how we arrived here. And that story starts not last week, not last year, but decades ago. Here is a fact that American automakers have been quietly furious about since the Reagan administration, and that almost nobody outside of trade policy circles actually knows. When an American car, a Ford F-150, a Chevrolet Silverado, a Cadillac, tries to enter the European market, it immediately faces a 10% import duty. That's before you even get to value-added taxes, which in major European markets like Germany and France can push the effective barrier on an American vehicle to well above 25%. You want to sell American in Europe? You're climbing a serious wall from the moment your product gets off the boat. Now flip it. When a European car entered the United States before this tariff, it faced a duty of 2.5%. 2.5, not 10, not 15. 2.5. An asymmetry so lopsided it was less a trade policy and more an open invitation. Come in, set up shop, and help yourself. And German automakers did exactly that, with extraordinary skill. Over 50 years, Mercedes-Benz, Audi, and Porsche didn't just enter the American market. They conquered the upper end of it. They built brand loyalty so deep that for a generation of American consumers, a German luxury car became the default symbol of having made it. While Detroit was filing for bankruptcy protection and negotiating government bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis, Munich and Stuttgart were posting record profits, large portions of which were earned in American showrooms with American money under trade rules that American negotiators had, somehow allowed to remain embarrassingly imbalanced for decades. Trump didn't invent the grievance. It was already there, sitting in trade policy white papers, in congressional testimony, in the private conversations of American auto executives who had been lobbying for protection for 30 years. What Trump did was pick it up, weaponize it, and deploy it at a moment of maximum vulnerability for the European economy. His framing is almost childishly simple, and that simplicity is exactly the point. You charge us 10%. We'll charge you 35%. Call it reciprocity. 9 words on social media sealed the deal. If you want to sell them here, build them here. 9 words. 5 decades of trade architecture undone. Let's talk about what 35% actually means in real money, because when you translate it into sticker prices, the whole thing becomes viscerally, immediately clear. A BMW 3 Series, one of the best-selling European luxury sedans in America, sitting around $45,000 at retail before this policy took effect. Add 35% to that number, and you're looking at just over $60,000 before dealer markups, before financing, before you've even talked to anyone about floor mats. That's not a premium. That's a completely different class of purchase. That's the kind of number that eliminates an entire category of buyer from the conversation before it even starts. Scale it up. A Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the flagship of the entire German luxury segment, which was sitting around $115,000, that car is now north of $155,000. A Porsche 911, already an aspirational purchase at $120,000, crosses $162,000. A Porsche Cayenne SUV that was sitting at $80,000 becomes a $108,000 vehicle overnight, pushed directly into a pricing range where it competes with cars it was never designed to compete with, at a disadvantage it can't overcome. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan both released urgent analysis within 24 hours of the signing. The projections were not cautious. They were stark. European car sales in the United States could decline by as much as 70% within the first fiscal quarter, not a year, a quarter, 3 months. 70% in 90 days is not a market correction. That is a market erasure. And Porsche's situation specifically deserves its own paragraph, because Porsche doesn't have an American factory to fall back on. Every single Porsche sold in the United States is assembled in Germany, loaded onto ships, and sent across the Atlantic. There is no alternative production facility. There is no backup plan. At 35%, the internal math reportedly became so impossible that Porsche's American sales operations were instructed to pause new orders entirely while the pricing team tried to figure out whether there was any version of this equation that could work. There isn't, not without a factory on American soil. And factories don't appear in 6 months. To understand why this tariff has been called catastrophic, not significant, not challenging, but catastrophic, by the German government's own economic advisors, you need to understand what the automotive sector actually is to the German economy. It's not an industry. It's a circulatory system. Germany produces roughly 4.1 million vehicles per year. Of that output, historically around 13% was destined for American driveways. The sector directly employs over 800,000 people inside Germany. When you trace the supply chain outward, the steel foundries, the electronic suppliers, the rubber and glass manufacturers, the precision engineering firms that exist primarily to serve the auto industry, the number of jobs economically connected to automotive exports rises above 2 million. 2 million people whose livelihoods are woven in some direct or indirect way into a trade relationship that just got blown up overnight. And here's what makes the timing genuinely brutal. Germany was already struggling before this tariff existed. Industrial orders had fallen more than 11%. The economy had technically entered recession in late 2024 after 6 consecutive quarters of declining manufacturing output. Volkswagen, one of the most institutionally powerful companies in European history, had already announced the potential closure of 3 domestic plants. That announcement triggered nationwide strikes. It became a government crisis. Workers at the Wolfsburg complex, where Volkswagen has been built since before the Second World War, held spontaneous walkouts. Into that already fractured landscape, Trump dropped a 35% tariff, like dropping a match into a room that was already full of smoke. The political fallout for German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has been particularly devastating on a personal level. Merz had publicly committed to building what he called a special business relationship with the Trump administration. He had traveled to Washington. His team had held private meetings. He had gone on record praising Trump's transactional style of diplomacy, arguing that economic pragmatism would shield Germany from the worst of America's protectionist instincts. The day the tariff was signed, Merz issued a statement calling it economic warfare. That is the strongest language a sitting German chancellor has directed at Washington in over 2 decades. And the distance between special business relationship and economic warfare, traveled in a matter of weeks, tells you everything about how completely this administration's actions defied even the most pessimistic European expectations. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen did not spend the hours after the tariff announcement drafting diplomatic appeals. She spent them building a retaliation list. The response from Brussels was immediate, and the language was notable for what it wasn't. It wasn't carefully hedged. It wasn't laced with references to dialogue and mutual respect and the importance of transatlantic partnership. It sounded, for the first time in memory, like a declaration of economic war from an institution that usually speaks exclusively in the language of careful process. Europe will retaliate. And it has chosen its targets with surgical precision. American agricultural exports are first. Soybeans from Iowa, bourbon whiskey from Kentucky, poultry from Georgia. Look at that list, and you're not looking at random product categories. You're looking at a map of Republican congressional districts. You're looking at the farmers, the distillers, the producers who voted for Trump in 2024 and who he cannot politically afford to alienate before the midterms. The EU has reportedly set its retaliatory agricultural tariff at 30%, high enough to make American products functionally uncompetitive on European supermarket shelves. Von der Leyen understands something that sometimes gets lost in the macroeconomics of trade war analysis. The fastest way to pressure a political leader is not to hurt the financial markets in his country. It's to hurt the people who elected him. And Europe is going directly after that pressure point with both hands. But agriculture is only the first volley. The second target is American technology. And this is where the retaliation transforms from painful to potentially catastrophic for U.S. corporate interests. Apple, Google, Meta, Amazon. These companies generate revenues inside the European Union that collectively run into the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The EU already has regulatory architecture in place, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, designed to constrain American tech dominance in European markets. Emergency provisions are being prepared that could impose punitive levies on digital service revenues earned within EU borders. To put a concrete number on what that means, Apple alone generates over $100 billion in annual revenue from European operations. A targeted levy of 15% on that revenue isn't symbolic. It's a multi-billion-dollar strike against one of the most powerful corporate lobbying forces in Washington. And those corporate lobbyists will not quietly absorb the pain. They will go directly to the White House. They will demand relief. And suddenly, the president who signed the Automotive Fair Trade Act will find himself managing furious pressure, not from foreign governments, but from the American business community that forms a core pillar of Republican economic support. That is the trap Europe is betting Trump walked into. And it may turn out to be a very well-constructed one. While the transatlantic relationship burns, let's talk about who pops the champagne. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis. The big three of American automotive manufacturing spent decades watching European brands carve out the most profitable segments of their home market. They lobbied, they complained, they submitted testimony, they funded think tanks, and for 30 years, nothing fundamentally changed. The asymmetric tariff remained. The European brands kept gaining ground. Then Trump signed a paper and gave them everything they'd been asking for in a single afternoon. European automakers collectively sold approximately 1.4 million vehicles in the United States last year at an average transaction price of around $65,000. Total annual revenue, roughly $91 billion. That market doesn't disappear because European brands become unaffordable. The people who were going to buy those cars still need cars. The demand doesn't evaporate, it redirects. And it's going to redirect into the waiting arms of domestic manufacturers who suddenly find themselves competing in a much less challenging environment. The math here is significant. If American automakers capture even 30% of that displaced demand, we're talking about a $27 billion revenue opportunity handed to them by government policy. That's not a competitive advantage earned through innovation or better products. That's an advantage manufactured by executive order. Trump's message to domestic industry was not subtle. In the same social media post where he announced the tariff, he addressed American automakers directly. The message was essentially, the field has been cleared. Now perform. The political expectation embedded in that message is unmistakable. Visible job announcements, new plant openings, hiring events with cameras present, all before the midterm elections. The tariff was simultaneously trade policy and a down payment on a political narrative. But there is a cost to all of this that is somehow getting very little attention in the victory celebrations happening in Detroit executive suites right now. Competition keeps prices honest. BMW and Mercedes weren't just selling luxury cars in America. They were forcing Ford, GM, and Stellantis to work harder across every segment of the market. The pressure of foreign competition is exactly what pushes domestic manufacturers to keep their pricing disciplined, their quality high, and their innovation meaningful. Remove that pressure, and you don't get a better domestic auto industry. You get a comfortable domestic auto industry. And comfortable industries raise prices. Independent economists are already projecting that average transaction prices for American-made vehicles could increase by 8 to 12% within 18 months, not because of any direct tariff effect on domestic manufacturers, but simply because the competitive pressure that kept them honest has been removed. The American consumer, who can't afford the newly priced out European option, may discover with unpleasant surprise that the domestic alternative has gotten significantly more expensive in the same window. And now we arrive at the issue that nobody in the White House appears to want to discuss publicly, even though every economist watching this situation is thinking about it constantly. Inflation. Cars don't exist in isolation. The automotive industry is deeply interconnected with steel, aluminum, semiconductors, glass, rubber, precision manufacturing, and dozens of secondary input markets. When American automakers rapidly scale up production to fill the vacuum left by European brands, and they will because the financial incentive is enormous, they create demand pressure across every one of those supply chains simultaneously. Steel prices rise. Semiconductor allocation tightens. Labor costs in manufacturing-heavy regions climb as factories compete aggressively for the same pool of skilled workers. And crucially, these cost pressures do not stay contained inside the automotive sector. They spread into construction, into appliances, into aerospace, into every corner of the American economy that depends on the same raw materials and the same workforce. The Federal Reserve spent the better part of 2 years bringing inflation back toward its 2% target after the post-pandemic price spiral. That was painful work. It required multiple interest rate increases that squeezed American households and businesses in ways that are still being felt. And the central bank is now watching a trade policy that has the structural potential to relight exactly those inflationary dynamics, not because of any single dramatic price jump, but through the slow compounding pressure of supply chain disruption and reduced competition working simultaneously. Europe knows this. And quietly, behind all the retaliatory rhetoric and the emergency statements from Brussels, there are senior officials who are playing a longer game than simple tit for tat. They're betting that American consumers, the same voters who elected Trump on explicit promises of lower costs and economic relief, will eventually feel this policy in their monthly car payments, their insurance premiums, and the sticker price on the replacement vehicle at their local dealership. And that when they feel it clearly enough, political pressure for reversal will build from inside the United States, independent of anything Europe does or doesn't do in response. The question isn't whether that pressure will materialize. Economic logic suggests it will. The question is timing. Will it arrive fast enough to matter politically, or will it arrive after the restructuring has gone so deep that reversing it becomes practically impossible? Here is the thing about trade wars that nobody wants to say out loud, because it disrupts the comfortable narrative that all of this is just negotiation theater, that there's a deal being set up somewhere, that the pressure will build, that both sides will eventually sit down and work something out, and the world will more or less return to where it was. That's not how this works. The factories in Stuttgart that go dark during this crisis do not automatically reopen when a new agreement gets signed. The supply chains that reroute around American ports during the disruption don't simply snap back into their previous configuration when diplomatic temperatures drop. The engineers and specialized workers who leave Germany's automotive sector, who find other jobs, who move into different industries, who relocate, don't return on the day a framework agreement is announced in Geneva. Institutional knowledge, production capacity, and industrial infrastructure, once dismantled, rebuild on timelines measured in years and decades, not months. Look at Mercedes-Benz specifically. The company sells approximately 350,000 vehicles per year in the United States, its single largest national market by volume. At 35%, that market doesn't just shrink. For many model lines, it becomes economically unviable. Mercedes has manufacturing capacity in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, producing certain SUV models for the American market. The company is now under enormous pressure to expand that footprint dramatically and rapidly. But dramatically and rapidly in automotive manufacturing means capital investment measured in the billions, workforce expansion measured in thousands, and timeline measured in years, not the months before the next election. The tariff is immediate. The structural response takes half a decade. And this gap between the speed of policy and the speed of industrial reality is where the real long-term damage gets done. In that gap, workers lose jobs that don't come back on the same terms. Supplier networks collapse and don't reassemble in the same configuration. Consumers adjust to a new normal of reduced choice and higher prices. And by the time a theoretical future negotiation produces a theoretical future agreement, the world those negotiators are trying to restore may no longer exist in the form they're imagining. The golden age of European automobiles in America, 50 years of Stuttgart engineering sitting in American driveways, shaping American taste, setting American aspirations, didn't end because of changing consumer preferences or evolving technology. It ended on a Tuesday morning with a pen stroke. So where does this end? The honest answer, and the one that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention, regardless of their politics, is that nobody knows. Not the economists, not the trade lawyers, not the executives in Detroit who are celebrating today and who may be managing an inflation spiral and a consumer backlash in 18 months. Not the officials in Brussels who are building a retaliation strategy that is going to hurt American consumers and American tech companies in ways that have nothing to do with the cars that started this. What began as a tariff on automobiles has already become something much larger, a fundamental rupture in the transatlantic economic relationship, a restructuring of global supply chains that will take years to trace fully, and an experiment in protectionism being conducted in real time on the world's two largest economies. Trump's bet is that the short-term political wins, the factory announcements, the hiring events, the narrative of an American president protecting American industry will land before the inflationary consequences and the consumer price pain become politically legible. That's not an irrational bet from a pure political timing standpoint, but it's a bet being made with the economic well-being of millions of people as the stake. Europe's bet is that pain travels faster than policy reversal, that American voters will feel this in their wallets before any restructuring takes permanent hold, that the coalition of American corporate interests damaged by European retaliation, the tech companies, the agricultural exporters, the financial services firms with deep European exposure, will apply enough internal political pressure to force a recalibration. Both bets might be wrong. The damage might simply compound on both sides until neither has a clean path back to where they started. The shipping docks at Bremerhaven will tell the story first. When the vessels stop coming and the logistics networks reroute and the workers in Wolfsburg start doing different math about their futures, that's when the abstract becomes concrete. That's when a morning tweet about reciprocity becomes visible in the lived reality of tens of millions of people on both sides of the Atlantic. The 35% tariff was signed in an afternoon. The consequences will arrive over a generation. And the world we knew before that signature, where a German car in an American driveway was an ordinary thing, where transatlantic trade was complicated but functional, where the rules, however imperfect, at least existed, that world is already gone. The only question now is what kind of world is being built in its place? And nobody, not in Washington, not in Brussels, not in Detroit, has an answer to that yet.